Listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and we just heard from T.N. Providence and the Jazz Zone. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, and Dr. Horne is the professor at Houston, University of Houston, and he is the chair of the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And his most recent book is The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. That is one of his over 40 books. And how are you doing today, sir?
Oh, it's all good. What about you?
I am, as Sam Cooke would say, I'm wonderful. I'm feeling pretty good.
Good.
Can't complain. You want to kick it off, Melinda?
Yeah, I mean, let's get into the implosion and the thing in the UK. Truss is out, resigns.
Yes, Liz Truss, the British Prime Minister, following Boris Johnson, who may be making a comeback, she served about 44 days. There was a tongue-in-cheek contest between her and a head of lettuce to see who would wilt first. This was after the mourning of Queen Elizabeth, and apparently the lettuce won. What happened was that she has some typically right-wing ideas, but as the temper of the time changes, it's not clear if these right-wing ideas are viable. They were never viable in any case, but they're hardly viable today. What I mean is that she wanted to cut taxes on the wealthy and then borrow to make up the shortfall and allow her to, for example, subsidize rising energy costs. And basically what happened is that a lot of international investors don't think that lending money to Great Britain is a good bet. And so you had a fall in the value of the pound, British currency. I recall when the pound was worth $2.40. It was almost at parity with the US dollar, £1 to $1 US. We have the rise of inflation in Great Britain. Some of this is the fallout from the Ukraine crisis with regard to energy costs, because energy costs impact everything. It impacts food, for example, because food has to be moved from point A to point B. Obviously, it impacts cost of airline tickets and the cost of operating your car, cost of heating your home. And so Liz Truss can be seen in one sense as another victim of what's being called the Zelensky curse. Mario Draghi, the Italian prime minister, driven out of office. Mr. Macron suffers significant parliamentary losses in June. We see the popularity of Chancellor Scholz declining, popularity of the Democrats, and Mr. Biden declining. And a footnote on that point, what's really dangerous about the United States right now is that the Democrats are virtually unanimous with regard to support for this Ukraine escapade. Republicans are split. If you watch Fox News, you'll see many stinging critiques of this escapade. And that's quite dangerous because it allows some of the right wing to cloak themselves in a peace garment, which is obviously fallacious and ridiculous. Part of this has to do, I'm afraid to say, with something we've been harping on for months, if not years, which is that the Black community is basically missing in action on the questions of war and peace, questions of foreign policy. This is a direct result of the deal cut in the 1950s, that is to say, in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, Black people threw overboard their internationalists like Paul Robeson, and that bargain expired a long time ago, but Black people act like they're Keith Sweat. They say, make it last forever. But I'm afraid to say it's not going to last forever. It's not lasting forever. And so this overthrow of Liz Truss is the latest evidence of the negative fallout from this Ukrainian adventure. The only question now is who will succeed her? Do not be surprised if Boris Johnson, the clown prince, makes a return to office. The other candidates include Rishi Sunak, who is of South Asian descent and has a fortune approaching $1 billion. He would be the candidate, I think, of the global 1%, but it's not clear if he has the support of the Tory party parliamentarians, because it's felt that he stabbed Boris Johnson in the back and when he led the charge to push him out of office a few months ago, not to mention the fact that the rank and file have to sign on to a Rishi Sunak prime minister post. And then there's Penny Mordaunt, another empty suit, not unlike Liz Truss. So there you have it.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Dr. Gerald Horne. We wanted to talk about the meaning of the turmoil in France. Now, France is there's a whole inter-imperialist rivalry. A lot of Africans from the West, primarily from the United States, went to France and used it as a refuge, while France was, hosting a lot of exiles, left-wing exiles from the United States. They were invading and doing all kinds of negative things to Algeria and Mali, Senegal, and Francophone Africa. Could you talk about the meaning of the turmoil in France?
Well, the turmoil I was referring to was internal. Unions were on the march last week, which is their wont, which is their tendency, protesting against the crisis of everyday living, not unlike what's happening across the channel, the rise in energy costs, which is once again impacting everything from food to driving your car to airline tickets. The difference between France and a number of other leading capitalist countries is that the unions tend to be more militant. They tend to be more hardline. And then, of course, you have a party, France Unbowed, led by the former Trotskyite, Mr. Mélenchon, which is similarly a militant, not have an equivalent either in London or Washington, either in Great Britain or the United States. I should have mentioned, talking about Great Britain, that the ruling class in London, I think, ultimately wants to have Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour guy, come into power, but that's going to be difficult unless there are new elections, which may take place. They're not supposed to take place to January 2025. They may take place earlier. And if they do take place, pay attention to how Jeremy Corbyn, the predecessor of Sir Keir, was swept out of office on spurious grounds of anti-Semitism. Al Jazeera did a special on that, and it was really quite shameful how the Guardian of London in particular, which has a reputation of being a left-leaning journal, participated in that charade. It was really quite awful, and I think it's a message that I hope is heeded on this side of the Atlantic, because ruling classes are beginning, I'm afraid to say, to instrumentalize this question of anti-Semitism, treating it in a very demagogic fashion. That's the way it was used against Jeremy Corbyn, who was far to the left of Sir Keir Starmer. the present Labour Party leader. Now, back to France, you mentioned French foreign policy in Africa, and of course, there have been virtual uprisings against France, particularly in Mali. And that brings us to the relationship between France and Washington and the United States, because the new term that has emerged of late is quite appropriate to describe that relationship. I'm speaking of the term frenemy. It's a combination of friend and enemy. That is to say, France and the United States have a common wish in ensuring that Africans themselves do not control the resources of what used to be called French West Africa, for example, the uranium in Niger, which is important to French nuclear plants. But France and the United States are at odds. They're enemies as opposed in terms of determining who's going to be the top dog in terms of being the #1 imperialist in that part of Africa. So that leads to this very contradictory relationship. For example, Mr. Biden is having his first state dinner. This is when all the elite dress up in tuxedos and the women in their evening gowns, and they have a lush banquet. And Mr. Macron will be the guest of honor in Washington. At the same time, France, just a few days ago, as we reported on this program, organized the European political community and did not invite the United States. They did not invite Russia either, but they did not invite the United States. And that's evidence of how France, understandably, they feel that this relationship with the United States has been a loser. I mean, it's wrecking the economies of Western Europe. The economies are heading backwards in time, all because Washington wants to weaken Russia so that it can then weaken China. And as Mr. Borrell, the European Union foreign policy coordinator, mentioned the other day, capitalist success in the European Union has been dependent upon cheap energy from Russia and cheap goods from China. And Washington is about to wreck that whole program. And so France, as a leader of the European Union, is trying to embark on a new path. And I dare say that given the fact that Mr. Macron is center-right at best, that this particular viewpoint of putting distance between Paris and Washington is something that's acceptable to most quarters in France, not only France Unbowed and Mr. Mélenchon, but also Marine Le Pen and the neo-fascists. So this is going to present a major challenge to North Atlantic foreign policy, and I hope Ottawa is paying attention.
And you are listening to Diasporic Music with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. We're on the line with Dr. Horne, the author of The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. You have another question, Melinda?
I guess we can move on to sort of like this growing, well, not growing. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but this, move and turn against China and, the Black communities. We've been talking about this for a while, turn against China.
Well, this is taking a dangerous turn of late. There's serious discussion, believe it or not, in the United States about war with China. I kid you not. And obviously, Canada will not be affected. I saw a headline just this afternoon that suggested and predicted that New York City would be destroyed by nuclear weapons within the decade. Now, that sounds rather alarmist, I admit. But how can Montreal, hundreds of miles to the north, survive if New York City is subjected to a mushroom cloud? Now, what's interesting about this conflict with China is that there is wide hostility to China in the United States of America. It unites virtually every wing of the U.S. ruling class. Remember how I mentioned how some of the Republicans are not as anti-Russia, particularly Mr. Trump, as the Democrats. Well, Democrats and Republicans across the board are generally hostile to China. Not only that, but as was mentioned in the setup, there's a lot of anti-China sentiment in the Black community of the United States, to the point where, and this is where we're getting into really dangerous ground, the thuggish, gangster-like sheriff of LA County, Mr. Villanueva, has been making the charge lately that anti-Asian sentiment and anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian American violence, I should say, which has been at epidemic levels in the United States, not least because of this hysteria about China that led to blaming the pandemic, the so-called China flu, as Mr. Trump called it. Mr. Villanueva says that Black people, particularly Black men, are the vanguard of this. Now, I find that to be demagogic and outrageous, but there is, I must confess, as I've suggested, anti-China sentiment. So what's interesting, as I said, is anti-China sentiment across the board, but the people who are being singled out and castigated are Black people, as if we're the vanguard, as if we're shaping the ideas for the ruling class, which is obviously ridiculous and ludicrous. But it's even infected the intellectuals. There's an organization called the American Studies Association. They have members in Canada, studies academically in the United States of America, even though title is, quote, American, unquote. And I joined and became a lifetime member, paid a big fee because they took a strong position on Palestinian rights, which was very unusual for academic groupings in the United States of America. In the latest issue of their academic journal, the American Quarterly, the lead article is basically equating racism in China with the racism in the United States, equating anti-Black racism in the United States with anti-Black racism in China. And so that gives you an idea of the depth of this anti-Beijing sentiment, which of course hit a fever pitch with the Party Congress taking place this past week, with Xi Jinping apparently is going to have a third term as both head of the Communist Party and president. And hardly any attention was paid to the economic plans of China. Instead, the focus was on China seeking to reunite with Taiwan, the rebel province off the coast of China that is, shall we say, nominally independent, but China claims as its own. Both the United States and China were brought to the brink of war just weeks ago when Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the third in line to lead the United States behind the president and the vice president, flew to Taiwan. And she was accompanied by a leader of the Congressional Black Caucus, Gregory Meeks. Interestingly, if you watch the video of Gregory Meeks and Nancy Pelosi at the airport in Taiwan, it's a metaphor for what I'm discussing. You would think Gregory Meeks was Marcel Marceau. That is to say that Nancy Pelosi turns and waves, Gregory Meeks turns and waves. Nancy Pelosi stops, he stops. Now, I was trying to figure this out. I mean, was he feeling that if he didn't imitate Nancy Pelosi, that people might think, what is this Negro doing on the tarmac in Taiwan, and maybe we should arrest him? And it was really strange. But in some ways, it was a metaphor for how the Black leadership is mimicking and imitating shamelessly the ideas and postures of the U.S. ruling class, including Nancy Pelosi, is sitting on a major fortune and whose husband, Paul Pelosi, interestingly enough, oftentimes profits on trades after just before a particular piece of legislation that Nancy Pelosi shepherds through Congress is consummated. The corruption stinks to high heaven, but even worse, as I've suggested, is this danger of a nuclear conflict between China and the United States.
And you're listening to Diasporic Music. We're on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne, the John Jay and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And when I was growing up in Los Angeles, we worshipped, I guess we were definitely in the minority, we worshipped the Chinese because Robert Williams who wrote the book Negroes with Guns. He was run out of Monroe, North Carolina, first to Cuba, then he went into exile into China. And we used to memorize the Red Book. And well, it was probably a West Coast thing, because I guess the Panthers were into Mao. But can we talk about the next question? Melinda, I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's go to the conflict in the Horn of Africa.
It's very serious. Despite all of the attention to Ukraine, the situation between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray population may be bloodier. The Tigrayans, as we've said before, only 6 to 7% of the population of Ethiopia, the second most populous nation in Africa after Nigeria. And yet you know that they ruled the country for decades up to the election of current Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And there has been a virtual uprising in Tigray province ever since. And part of the turning point in terms of the decline of the fortunes of the Tigrayans came when the Eritreans, neighboring Eritreans, intervened on behalf of the government in Addis Ababa. They have a bone to pick with the Tigrayans, because when the Tigrayans ruling Ethiopia, they came into sharp conflict with the Eritreans, and now the Eritreans are engaging in payback. So what's happening is that there's going to be a mediation session in South Africa. And I was happy to see that, because the United States has been trying to be involved in a mediation, but the United States does not come to the mediation session with clean hands, put it mildly. So I'm optimistic that the situation can be resolved. And staying in the Horn of Africa, I should also mention the crisis in Somalia. The famine there, and famine is generally a product of political conditions, and certainly that's the case in Somalia. Famine is proceeding apace. The international community has been laggard in responding because of this over-concentration on the Ukraine. And I should also say that with regard to that part of Africa generally, speaking of Northeast Africa has been impacted severely by the Ukraine crisis, insofar as a good deal of the grain, the wheat that goes into Egypt, for example, and then from there throughout the sub-region, had been coming from Ukraine up to the fact that the war was, or special military operation was commenced. And of course, there has been impact on fuel prices as well. So there's a real economic crisis in Egypt, in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, that is exacerbated in the latter by this conflict between the Tigrayans and the government of Ethiopia.
Now, could you talk about Turkey's new role?
Yes, Turkey is playing a very interesting game right now. On the one hand, they're supplying drones and other military materiel to Ukraine. On the other hand, it's apparent that Mr. Putin and President Erdogan have a kind of bromance going. In fact, they've been meeting so much lately that it's not even remarkable when they come together. In their last meeting, Mr. Putin announced that Russian natural gas instead of being exported through pipelines, one of which is damaged, as you know, subjected to sabotage, other pipelines going through Ukraine, that was no longer operative, that if the Western Europeans wanted Russian natural gas, they'd have to get it from Turkey. Turkey is going to be the hub for export of Russian natural gas. And that gives Turkey a very strong position within Europe, because Turkey, along with their comrades in Russia, or Turkey, I should say, can determine if Western Europeans freeze in the dark. And we all know, because we talked about it on this program, that in 2016, US imperialism was involved in a coup attempt against Turkey, barely failed. Mr. Erdogan has not forgotten that. And so this is the state of play. Now, since I'm in that part of Europe, let me make a footnote with regard to popular culture. Your fellow Black American, known as Ye, Kanye West, has been much in the news lately. He had a debut in his fashion line of this White Lives Matter t-shirt, which is adopting the lingo of the ultra-right. You know that some months ago, a few years ago, he talked about how slavery was a choice, because otherwise, why did it last so long? It was obviously an insult to his ancestors, not to mention ours. But the reason I'm linking this to Turkey is because his daughters, his children, are half Armenian. Their mother, Kim Kardashian, is of Armenian descent. We all know that Armenia was subjected to a genocide by the Turks approximately 105 years ago. I've oftentimes suggested, perhaps even on this program, that it's difficult to take Kanye or Ye seriously when he insults Black people. You may want to consider taking him seriously if he denies the Armenian genocide. But I don't think he's going to do that, because he's an opportunist. He's a fraud. He's a faker.
Kanye is. How much do you think it is his bipolar situation? Does it have anything to do with his medication, or is he just out and out a fraud?
Well, maybe, but there are lots of people with bipolar who don't take right-wing positions. I mean, why does mental illness cause one to take right-wing positions? I mean, why does a mental illness cause one to take left-wing positions? It doesn't add up as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps the mental illness in the context of a right-wing country pushes him in that direction, but I mentioned how I don't think he's going to come into conflict with the Armenian community. He's already in conflict with the Jewish community, because after he had that debut with the White Lives Matter t-shirt, he was criticized by fellow hip-hop entrepreneur Sean P. Diddy Combs. And then Ye said that Mr. Combs is controlled by so-called Jewish interests. And then many in the Jewish community got upset with him. And then he said that he's going to go, quote, DEFCON, unquote, against the Jewish community, which I think he was trying to say that he was going to go nuclear against the Jewish community. I think that's what he was trying to suggest. And so, Mr. West, I would encourage the young man to cool his jets, because he's wandering into very dangerous territory.
Yes, sir. This is the last question. Could you talk about the beginning of the NBA season? How do you see it?
Well, a lot of the commentary has been about the Lakers in your hometown, because the lineup doesn't look very good right now. They look terrible in their games. Russell Westbrook is being blamed. I think that's unfair. Anthony Davis a few years ago was considered one of the top 5 players in the league. He's not part of the conversation right now. LeBron James is 37, 38 years old. It's unfair to expect him at that advanced age to lead the club. On a more positive level, Golden State Warriors look good. The LA Clippers look good. The Boston Celtics look good. The New Orleans team looks great with Zion Williamson.
Zion, how is he doing?
He looks great. He's changed his diet. He's been working out. He's gotten rid of a lot of that baby fat. The thing about Zion Williamson, and this, you could say the same thing about Charles Barkley when he was playing, that he's a quick jumper. What I mean by that is that he can go up, come back down, and go back up again very quickly, more so than most players. I mean, he has a lot of spring in his legs, and that gives him quite an advantage, not to mention that he's almost 285 pounds and now is more muscular than he's ever been. Now, what about your Toronto Raptors?
In terms of, they are in almost a rebuilding mode, and Scotty Barnes, what's his name, is leading the team. The brother from Cameroon, Siakam, and they're promoting Scotty Barnes, and Nick Nurse is a very innovative coach. I have a lot of faith in him, but I think they might make the playoffs this year, but I don't see them in the conference that the Raptors are in is a little bit too much. They got too much weight in it.
Mm-hmm.
Too much weight.
See.
But Nick Nurse is pretty sharp cookie when it comes to the basketball thing. But he's doing a lot of things with literacy. Like he's doing a lot of, he's doing music and basketball and literacy. He's doing quite a bit of things in the community, in the oppressed community here in Toronto. Sort of like taking the role that Kyle Lowry was doing that, and what's the other brother's name? Serge Ibaka used to do a lot of things in the community. So. And Vince Carter, the Raptors have a history of trying to link with the black and the oppressed communities. Period.
Oh, okay. Hey, you need a new theme song, Nick Nurse to the theme of Night Nurse.
Oh, I heard Bruce Springsteen. Marvin, Bruce Springsteen has a video out where he's singing Night Nurse. It's, Bruce Springsteen, he needs to be baptized in the Baptist church, but, he needs a little, maybe he should change his diet and get some, get him some collard greens and some cornbread, but, he does a pretty nice version of it, but his diction is not right. You know what I mean?
I understand.
All right. So thank you very much, sir, and looking forward to you hearing from you next week.
Good luck to you.
And Melinda Francis, on behalf of Melinda and Lisa Trotz. Oh my goodness, I'm thinking about Lisa Watson. Lisa Truss from Guyana. Let's send her a shout out. Anything else you'd like to add, Melinda?
No, people stay well. COVID is moving, so stay well, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.